So this morning a bit, we'll talk, of course, in depth about the value and the importance and the urgency of inclusion diversity in classical music and the arts overall. But more specifically, I want to spend a few moments speaking about the existing historical barriers that have plagued our industry and our society for a long time, and really in some ways a way out of it or a way beyond it. And to me, the primary way beyond it is for us to evolve or better redefine the importance and the meaning of artistic excellence. So to kind of talk a little about my own background, my own story, I have spent the past 24 years or more of my life in the nonprofit sector, specifically working in the sphere of classical music and the arts and performing arts, and the importance of diversity and inclusion. My own background is such that my degree work is in music performance, specifically violin, with some work in pedagogy as well. I'm a graduate of the University of Michigan School of Music, Theater, and Dance. My past lives include teaching extensively, particularly violin, but now I actually am a proud member of faculty at Roosevelt University, their master's degree in administration and leadership. I also spent some years working in a for-profit sector and trying to sort of, in many ways, find myself and my place where I can help have impact. Um, Personally, I'm a mom to two boys, also one cat, and a partner to another boy. I'm an avid cook. I absolutely love and live on tea, coffee, and good music, which might be more relevant to today's talk. To go back to the very beginning, I was actually born in Moscow, Russia, and grew up in Azerbaijan, which is a tiny little green dot there on the Bay of Caspian Sea. So it's an area just north of Iran and part of former Soviet Union. I was fortunate to have excellent training and access to wonderful, well-rounded arts and classical music education. One of the great things about my upbringing was such that everyone, without regard to ethnic background or one's zip code, had access to well-rounded music education in community music schools, which were assigned to absolutely every district in every major city. So I come from a family of non-artists and non-musicians, at least not in its classic sense. My mother is a Romance languages linguist and a pedagogue of French and Latin. My father, who has been gone for a while, but is by background a chemical engineer, although as a young person he did play the accordion for a while. So when I was 5 years old, I heard the Moscow virtuosi play on my television set. And one of the things that, I think I didn't fully grasp or appreciate the value of, I grew up with three television channels, one being dedicated entirely to Soviet propaganda, one being entirely engrossed in cinema. So you'd see movies, old and new, that were all inspired kind of by patriotism, and that mixed with news. And then there was entirely a channel that was dedicated to the work of culture and the arts. So you'd hear the best music, you'd see wonderful ballets and operas, and as such, because I think it was definitely believed that the arts, particularly performing arts, are meant to have a vital part in the upbringing of any young person. So I was listening to the Moscow virtuosi and asked my parents to get me a violin because I was so inspired by the brilliance of the sound, and they kind of chuckled and said, oh, that's very sweet, but we think that there are other ways in which you can develop yourself, and probably something that would end up leading you to a lucrative career, and they didn't see the arts as one of those. So I kept insisting for another year, and finally when I turned 7, I said, well, maybe I can just take lessons on the side. And my mother took me to a community music school where they do a basic check of your response to rhythmic structure and pitch. And if you respond adequately, they admit anyone who essentially wants to study. And that was my introduction to the violin and classical music. And I think the rest I could say is history, in that it has transformed and enriched my life in ways that I never could have imagined as a 7-year-old. I should say that kind of right before I get into the case for the case for diversity and its importance in classical music, I ended up in the States by way of complete happenstance, and that in the mid 90s, my home country, my native country, was in many ways falling apart. It was dissolving literally and figuratively, both on a philosophical but also on a geopolitical level. And myself coming from a mixed race background, my parents strongly believed that it was unlikely that we would have a safe journey to our future and be able to pursue our education and career. And as such, they wanted to ensure the future for my sister and myself. And through a set of all sorts of exercises, at least on a temporary basis, I ended up finding myself in the States in year 1994. And although the intention was not to stay permanently, I mean, I think we all plan and God laughs, as my grandmother used to say. And about a year or so into it, I found myself applying to the University of Michigan and ended up staying, even though eventually my family actually turned around and went home as things settled in and our republic gained its independence and sovereignty. I ended up staying at the University of Michigan and pursuing my degree work and building my life and finding my partner. So to that end, in the mid 90s, I met a transfer student in my undergraduate violin studio, who talked to me about the importance of diversity. And the man's name was Afa Dworkin. He himself was a biracial violinist, but for all intents and purposes, to a foreigner like myself, to me, I identified him as a Black violinist, which was significant, but in a fashion that I don't think I fully recognized or internalized. He talked to me about the kind of the poignancy of finding himself as the only or less than one of a handful of people of color in any musical setting. And at the time, I didn't recognize what all that meant and how isolating and lonely it must have felt to be the only one in your orchestra, the only one in your choir, the only one on stage, the only one as a member of an audience at an opera or an orchestra. And he began to ask why that was. So for him as a young person, it was a journey into the anthology of classical music, into the repertoire. And as we had those conversations as an undergraduate student myself, I felt almost defensive. So I fashioned myself a buff of classical music repertoire, and certainly repertoire for orchestras, as well as certainly the violin. So defensively, I said, well, certainly there's music by Black composers. Let's think about, I don't know, Scott Joplin. Let's think about Duke Ellington. And he said, that's great. I'm talking about music by classical Black composers. And when was the last time that you could remember studying a concerto by a composer of any color that you took on stage or performed in a concerto competition with, or heard on stage by another violinist? And, that thought began to plague me as well. And then we kind of delved into it a little further. And keep in mind, at this point, this is an undergraduate transfer student who has this dream of moving the needle. And he begins to look at the statistics. And while these aren't the statistics that he presented to me at the time, in that they looked even more starkly painful, he began to kind of build the case for me. So I think what's really, really important about this work is to not look at the statistics from the standpoint or vantage point of a vacuum, but really contextually. In that, at the time that Sphinx began to be an idea, we knew that Black and Latinx musicians comprised together about 1.5% in American orchestras on stage every day, every season. So to me, that was unfathomable, but largely because of the way in which that compared to the population representation. So these statistics I'm about to share today are about a couple years old, and we're finding that Blacks are under 2%, but as compared to now nearly 14% in population. Latinx musicians, less than 2.5%, but as compared to about 17 or 18% in population. So great deal of stark underrepresentation and a complete lack of balance, right? Often, still to this day, I get the question, which is a fair question, as to why Sphinx itself does not also embrace or focus its work on Asian or Asian American musicians. And for us, it is a matter of balance again, because as we look at representation in orchestras as compared to representation in population, there's actually a case of overrepresentation. So it's great news that the work does not need to focus on that. And then the pie chart really tells the bigger story, because you see that our orchestras are predominantly white, nearly 90%. So of course, that's highly concerning. We also recognize that diversity and representation in orchestras is more complex than what we see on stage. It is also those who are the thought leaders behind it, and those who, of course, work tirelessly behind stage to empower and enable this work. So as we look at that, of course, music directors, not a terribly big surprise, I'm sure, to everyone who's tuning in, because anecdotally, it makes sense that we barely ever see music directors or conductors, but more specifically, Blacks again representing less than 2.5%, Latinx less than 2%, and really predominantly, this is still quite white or white European centric. Executive directors, that's even more concerning in that there's certainly not the restriction that comes with blind auditions, lack of engagement, and CBA agreements and other ways in which progress would be incremental. But yet we're seeing that here the picture is even more concerning, in that we have Blacks at less than 0.5% and Latinx less than 1%. And the next two pie charts to me are most counterintuitive. Artistic administrators, people who are charged with the vision and the execution and operation of the artistic heart and soul and really content of what we do with orchestras. And there, the representation is at a statistical 0, which makes no sense, because after my nearly 25-year history, I know that talent is not the answer, or lack thereof. And certainly experience is not the answer, but representation somehow lacks in such a stark fashion. And there we have education and community engagement directors or community relation directors. And you would think that on an instinctive level, this would be an easier way to recruit, because these are liaisons into our communities. So of course, it seems that this would make a lot of sense to have representation here. And yet again, though, contrary to popular belief, Blacks are at 3%, Latinx at less than 2.5%, again, predominantly white. So this just gives sort of the foundation, but also the impetus behind why it was important to launch something, an effort like Sphinx back in the late 90s to really try and shift the needle. So just briefly about Sphinx, which of course is easy to look up online our work, but in brief, we are a national nonprofit whose mission is transforming lives through the power of diversity in the arts. We reach about 10,000 people in our annual programming every year, and even now in the age of COVID, about 2 million in our live and broadcast audiences. An area where Sphinx really focuses and work is to be a grant-giving organization to its artists of color. So we focus a lot on securing scholarships and empowering the careers of Black and Brown artists. We have 3 touring ensembles, the Sphinx Virtuosi, which is a chamber orchestra that is conductorless and travels around the country throughout the seasons, and now does so digitally. We have a professional choir named Exigence that also does a lot of touring work and focuses on new music very much. And then we have the Sphinx Symphony, which is our professional all Black and Latinx orchestra that is sort of the festival orchestra to the Sphinx competition. Now, with our more than 800 alumni, we envision ourselves and see ourselves as an organization that is service to the field. We champion change in education, performance, and arts leadership and entrepreneurship, because ultimately we do believe in pushing change forward through not only our own direct work, but the work of artists and leaders directly, and the work of the field. So very much inclusive of our educational partners like the Jacobs School. I also think it's really important to look at diversity in its statistics from as a well-rounded data point as we can to fully understand where we go wrong. This next slide sometimes comes as a surprise to many friends and colleagues and our audiences, in that we look at underrepresented minorities, culturally underrepresented, and musicians in our community schools, and we find something that's really peculiar, which to me is important and exciting because it debunks the myth of a pipeline problem, in that it's the first point at which I build my argument in saying that sacrificing artistic merit or making the argument that somehow talent is picked by demographics or talent isn't as present in young people who come from communities of color is just absolute falsehood, right? Because we see that in community music schools, we are about as diverse as we are in our actual communities, where essentially white students represent about half, Black and African American are about 20%, and Hispanic and Latinx is about a 20% as well. So we see that if talent and affinity and participation is present at that young age, we know that we're doing something wrong as a society or as a field later. So it's not a pipeline issue. You'll hear me say that a few times, and it is absolutely not a talent issue. And this statistic, by the way, comes from the National Guild from Community Arts Education, who has done a good job tracking this picture to help educate the field. Now, as we advance further relative to academic participation, we see that numbers starkly drop, and that's of course very concerning, because when we get to undergraduate participation, we see a totally different picture. We see that we're about 5.5% each time. And then to diploma and master's degrees, specialty degrees, we drop off again and again into doctorals. And of course, not surprisingly, we have a lack of representation in faculty. So what does that tell us? I think one of the first lessons I'm learning from this is to say that this is an engagement, retention, recruitment, and nurturement issue, in that we are not empowering and encouraging and enabling, really, our young musicians of color to look at participation at a college level as a feasible, viable career path. So one of the first questions that comes my way often is, what can we do differently? Well, we can recruit differently. We can go to all of these community music schools and intentionally and mindfully target our recruitment practices in such a way that identifies these talented young musicians early and sets up a way and builds these preparatory programs whereby that bridge can be built. So that by the time it comes time for us to do some recruitment for our undergraduate degree, imagine if those numbers were doubled. And you know that we can, purely mathematically speaking, but also artistically speaking. Imagine how improving and leveling off that bridge would then set us up for graduate degree programs and master's and diploma and performance degrees, and then on to doctorates and faculty. So that's kind of the most important first opportunity for us to sustain this importance of an evolved concept of artistic merit through engagement, through that intentional recruitment. And then I think kind of the rest of my theory on this is that it takes all of us. It takes an insistence and commitment to leading from every seat. It debunks the pipeline myth on an anecdotal level. I should also say that Sphinx for the past 14 years or 15 years has run its preparatory programs. We refer to them as Sphinx Performance Academies, of which there are 3 every year. This is a competitive program that selects pre-college level, so teenage Black and Brown musicians, identifies them on a competitive basis, and then provides them with intensive training during the summers in both solo performance as well as chamber music and early ensemble musicianship, music theory, etc. So every year, we're only able to accept less than 25% of our entire applicant pool. And these musicians, if there were resources and spaces, we would accept twice as many. I have no doubt about it, because we have long, lengthy um, waiting lists populated with these incredible musicians who are ready to go and good for any conservatory. So that's like another backing from my end of a pipeline myth. There's not a pipeline problem. There's not a talent or a preparation problem. We can no longer use that as an excuse. There is an accountability problem. Where does the buck stop? Should music schools and conservatories blame or sort of fault the rest of the field or the preparatory institutions who don't make it clear how talented and populous the talent pool is? Or does it really stop with or start with music schools and conservatories who don't do the proactive work of recruiting these young musicians? Sometimes it is as simple as teachers and recruiters saying there's not enough resources. Well, that is another myth that we have the privilege of debunking today, in that there are countless of resources. There's a diverse composers database that avails us of incredible literature and repertoire. Sphinx alone houses many of these important databases and libraries. In its resource page, we link to incredible catalogs of music, of critical editions. So there's not a reason why the canon, the literature, the repertoire wouldn't have shifted by now, and not a reason that we're not prioritizing it today. There's a Black Composer series that's championed by the Rachel Barton Pine Foundation. All kinds of ways in which we can prioritize, focus on this cultural diversity today. There's a piece on engagement, role models and ambassadorship. To me, role models are essential and important. So until such time that we prioritize hiring faculty of color, and until such time that we prioritize hiring staff of color who will work tirelessly to ensure that the climate at a music school and a conservatory is such that would be welcoming and comfortable and safe to Black and Brown musicians and really students of color in general, I don't think that we will succeed in evolving that new standard of excellence for our institutions. Ambassadorship, I see that as developing these young ambassadors who will come in and find themselves in any institution and be able to go back into their own communities and help the younger generation. So that pipeline, that pathway needs to be established and nurtured and insisted upon. And when we talk about tradition and pretext, a way to debunk the myth that, oh, well, classical music and training is simply not part of the heritage or anthology or tradition within communities of color is also untrue, because we have examples and plenty of literature now that can educate us and say that we have Black and Brown composers dating to, at least as far as we know, the Renaissance era. There is everyone from Joseph Boulogne St. George to the music of New Spain, which is Baroque. In the Latinx culture. And I think it comes with not only educating ourselves, but also nomenclature, how we choose to communicate about it. I think we have to stay clear of things like Black Mozart. It is Joseph Boulogne St. George. He has a name. He does not need to be compared to or likened to somebody or his European white counterpart. And I think sometimes I think about the danger of merit, and that's really the danger of defining merit. Remember that merit is really the heart and soul of what we term as artistic excellence. We cannot be excellent until we are representative. And in every other field, technology, banking industry, fields that have, while they've got a long way to go, they've certainly excelled beyond what the arts have done. But every other field has come to terms with recognizing that that we'll get the best results, most innovative results, most thoughtful and lasting results if we combine in a room folks from every possible background, where diversity of thought is important. And diversity of thought, of course, comes from diversity of experiences and diversity of tradition and one's cultural background. So I think until such time that we can embrace that our Our excellence is very much directly linked to diversity and lack thereof. We're not going to evolve. And I think that concept has to continue to be pushed, because I think it will address this mythologically and falsely based premise that somehow when we talk about diversity, we also have to prepare ourselves for somehow a sacrificial measure or a demoted definition of merit. And I think nothing could be farther from the truth. So what is success? Oftentimes my own students ask me. I think it starts with people. Who do you have working on this? As an advocate, who do you pair with? Who do you partner with? Who do you marry up to in some ways? And how do you really build your own tribe that's going to perpetuate this work? So I think that intentionality, that the importance of picking the right people to do this, I think cannot be underscored. And I think it's also important to recognize that this is everybody's fight. We have to have our leaders of color. We also have to have our allies, and no one can shirk away from that responsibility. And otherwise, we won't achieve that evolved definition of excellence. I think, again, remembering excellence is representation. I think trust, we have to recognize and come to terms with the fact that when for centuries and decades on end, we have not built these bridges, we have not engaged in an authentic, real way, that communities of color, that parents, families who are involved, our partners in this recruitment strategy and engagement strategy, have not had the opportunity to build trust to large, predominantly white institutions. So that trust has to be built. It needs to be earned. It cannot be assumed, presumed, or expected without the work. And integrity, to me, integrity, and this isn't my definition, of course, but that is doing the right thing when no one's watching. So it is doing the right thing when my dean or provost is not necessarily watching how I'm building my curriculum, when, you know, the National Association for Schools of Music has not mandated certain metrics for diversity, when the students of color in my classroom aren't the ones calling me to task and saying, the content of what you're teaching is not informed by the cultural contributions and experiences of people of color. It is doing the right thing when I'm alone in the classroom, in the studio or virtual room, and when it falls upon me to build something new and reinvent and redefine my own commitment to diversity, which I have to do continuously, even though the entirety of my adult life has been dedicated to this work. I always say that by our actions, we earn from people the desire to help, the willingness to connect, and the trust that the advice or a resource that they give will be wisely used to carry out a mission they identify with or relate to or admire. And I think that very simple sentence has to be one of the important things I remind myself of. If I'm building a new program at Sphinx, or if I'm shifting what we're doing because I feel it's not as effective as it can be, or if I'm building a module for my students at Roosevelt, I say, who do you have in your corner? Who are your people? How do you define your excellence? How hard have you worked to develop trust? And what are you doing when I'm not checking on you? And to me, those are kind of important metrics of success. The greatest fallacy and opportunity of our time. How often have you heard DEI means sacrificing merit? No, DEI is an authentic recipe for merit. And sometimes when people ask, well, what is really merit? I literally use this. How often have you observed or almost implicitly heard people say, we do DEI so that we could reach out to those who are less fortunate? That's wrong. We are less fortunate for not prioritizing representation and diversity. Or we do DEI work to satisfy a funding requirement. Well, for many of our cultural institutions, we do DEI work because it's now a requirement or a metric by which our success is measured. Is that good or bad? I don't know, but I know that's not enough. So lasting change will stay if we look beyond external requirements, those which are imposed upon us by others. DEI is a product of performative wokeness. That's my little terminology that I've seen since the catalyzing events of last spring and summer. There has been, a multitude and volumes of statements, and I say this too with a bit of cynicism. I've given 26 talks since last May, since George Floyd's murder. It's a privilege, but I wonder why that number has to be such today and it wasn't so before. Does it take a tragedy? And I say in response to that, we must act and hold ourselves accountable instead of just performing in front of others and saying the important things or things that we hope or suspect that people want to hear from us. We got to do it when we're not asked either. So our job today is understanding the importance of diversity. Remember, it is not about reaching out to those less fortunate. It is about doing the right thing because it's the right thing for our field and our industry. We're rubbing ourselves blind by not being representative and diverse. Sure, it is also affording equity and doing the right thing because for centuries, implicitly and explicitly, we have robbed other people of that opportunity. But it is also about establishing that equity because without it, we can't thrive either. We can't thrive together as a society. It is about empowering and tirelessly supporting our artists. And that means engaging them, putting them forward, giving them resources that are lacking, and acknowledging that that is priority. Ensuring sustainability, that to me means look beyond today, look beyond this one opportunity that we have to speak together. Look about and make a commitment for 10 years. I've been insisting that we should build these metrics and best practices, not for this year, not for the next year, but commit to a decade. Advocate, advocate, advocate. Every time and anytime there's an opportunity, someone reaches out to you and says, what can you do? Put your colleague of color forward and advocate on their behalf. It's the only way that we all prioritize this. Seek out creative ways to make the economic case. I do this for orchestras and other performing arts institutions, like performing arts presenters and presenting houses. We have to diversify our revenue stream, and it's wrong to assume that communities of color won't participate due to demographic or economic disadvantage. Actually, communities of color are highly and deeply philanthropic, and they know how to support art, culture, and prioritize education. So making that economic case is also extremely important. And on the flip side, for those of us, for institutions who depend upon both earned and contributed revenue, it's also a way to show our philanthropic partners and institutions that we're prioritizing it, and as such, being able to sustain and retain our grants. Do the right thing, again, when no one's watching. I know it's a repeat sentence, but I can't say that enough. Of course, we can't do this work alone. How do we find people? How do we tell our story? To whom do we tell our story? And there are many ways to do this. One of the ways is to connect with advocates and fellow allies and seek out the leaders in this field. I know Sphinx alone hosts an annual convening. Now we will do it virtually this year, but usually it is live in February in Detroit, charming time of year when everyone gets together, but it's called Sphinx Connect. There's never a financial obstacle to attending something like this, but we build it because it's a homecoming to both artists, musicians of color, but also allies and partners who are doing this work globally. And there's usually more than 1,000 people that join us in this work together. You can find information on that on our website. And of course, some other programs through which one can get involved with Sphinx. In the wake of twin pandemics, as my colleague refers to it, we have issued a national call to action, which can be found directly on our homepage, and some extremely specific recipes are given and suggestions are given to students, faculty, administrators, leaders, allies of things we can all do. Sphinx Lead is our relatively new administrative leadership program, and that is one's access to the leaders of tomorrow who are going to be the next deans and directors and music directors and artistic administrators and fundraisers. That can be, it's a way to connect with them. There's National Alliance for Audition Support. This is a conglomerate of 80 orchestras who work together with us to create a program that enriches and empowers careers of Black and Brown musicians who are orchestra bound. And also ultimately, it's looking at artists. Artists are our leaders. They're the ones who will lead the way for us into a more just and equitable future. So at Sphinx, I've prioritized and continue to insist upon evolving our own approach to be artist-centric, listening, asking questions when I don't know how to do something in fundraising, when I don't know how to bring something to scale, when I'm stuck about ways to round out or really zero in an initiative, I ask an artist. Their perspective is essential. It is important. There's always something to learn. Ultimately, I love quotes. And sometimes I think about this one concept that troubles me frequently. When I talk about programming, folks ask me, well, are you saying to do away with the incredible tradition of excellence? Are you saying to push Beethoven and Mozart and Bruckner and Wagner away from our stages? And I am not in any way saying that. I'm saying there's room for everything. And to me, this is a piece of inspiration that 1,000 candles can be lighted from the flame of one, and the life of that candle is not shortened. No, by me insisting and saying that we program Florence Price and William Grant Still and Sylvester de Vueltas and others, it does not mean push Beethoven and Mozart away. It means make space for all of it. We are richer and better and more excellent the more diverse we are. So let us work together to really achieve a future in which our orchestras, our music schools, our conservatories, our community music schools, our audiences are as rich and vibrant as the communities in which we reside. So that is my pitch for today. I will open it up to questions and welcome an opportunity to engage.
Wow, that is just absolutely incredible. Thank you so much for a fantastic presentation and really just outstanding. There's so many things that I'm thinking of right now which take me in so many different directions. You know, and I guess one of the places that I'd like to start, it strikes me, you know, not what you're doing and what the Sphinx organization is doing as a whole, as an organization in the United States, is both something to celebrate and something to admire, but it's also a sign that classical music can be a vital part of our future in ways that I think so many classical music organizations and legacy, you know, entities don't fully comprehend. As an organization, the Sphinx organization has in fact been expanding through this time, right? Has been expanding through a time where many classical music organizations and institutions feel threatened and perhaps are having to downsize and are challenged to survive within the sort of ecosystem, the cultural and economic ecosystem that they've defined for themselves. And yet, on the other hand, we have the Sphinx organization that's in fact expanding and booming. And one of the things that strikes me about how you've positioned yourself as an organization within the United States is that you think about yourself in a way that's different to the way that most classical music organizations think about themselves. Can you just, because I know that your mission statement, you know, defines that as well. Give us a sense of you know, in a distilled way, what is it that defines the Sphinx organization in terms of what it's trying to do?
It's a great question and a great pretext for it. In short, we see ourselves as a catalyst for change being defined as a movement of having the field of performing arts and classical music in particular be representative of our communities. Mm-hmm. We see ourselves as a service to the field organization in that I've always recognized that Sphinx can't push its work forward or its mission forward without our partners and allies. So we see ourselves as a part of a fabric of other institutions whose work is very relative and relatable and relevant in that we're all working toward sharing the richness that is offered and the benefit that's offered by study of and participation and performance of the arts and classical music, but we're just coming at it from different angles.
And it's
And
refreshing, and it's refreshing to me that you're basically, I don't know whether this is my interpretation, but it seems to me that the Sphinx organization is saying, look, classical music can be experienced by all. Classical music can represent all. Classical music can be a fully fledged part of our society, in amongst the multitude of everything else that exists, rather than separated from everything else that exists. So there's this very refreshing sense that that the approach that the Sphinx organization is taking enables this art music world. I like to think of classical music as art music, and let's forget the classical music part of it for a second, that this art music world can truly represent our society and can be responsive to our society in ways that are deeply meaningful, right? And that's
absolutely.
just so refreshing to this idea of a prescriptive approach that classical music organizations have found themselves locked into, this almost conditional relationship with the world where we can only flourish in the world if we do X, Y, and Z, right? Whereas what I'm hearing you say is we can release ourselves from that and just naturally connect ourselves to the world, and it will work.
Absolutely. I'm even pushing it slightly further by saying, I am not sure if we don't embrace that approach that classical music will survive, because on a practical level, we cease to exist, we become extinct unless we're relevant, right?
Right.
So if we take away or diminish or deplete the relevancy piece of classical music to our ever-changing communities, then, logically speaking, we can look at ourselves and say, oh, I don't know that it will be here for my children or grandchildren. And I think that's a great shame.
Hmm.
The art and art music is the narrative of our society. Our society is shifting. Our urban centers are becoming majority minority, and that is incredibly empowering. So
Yeah.
I think now is such a fantastic time to to really not only rid ourselves of limiting definitions, but also look for that richness, look for that resonance, for that creativity
Hmm.
within communities that have been waiting to be embraced, really. And that, yes, I think sometimes that means get out of the way
Right.
and make room for leadership that looks different than us.
Yeah. Something that I'd like to take us to, we had a conversation earlier in the semester, and you were very generous to come and speak to my class, and I was very taken by some of what you spoke about in terms of your background, because I think that having grown up in an environment in a community in which it was sort of taken for granted that students have access to the sort of education that they have access to performing music, to art music, and I don't want to paint too much of a rosy picture about it, but essentially the assumption was that automatic access to performance through the arts was a natural part of community, right? And I know that coming to the United States, you've had to, recalibrate and think about how you engage with the world in a different way. Can you speak to the power of, because, I'm thinking specifically in terms of where we're headed in our relationship with the communities that exist in South Central Indiana and the rural engagement activity and this big project that the Jacob School of Music is now undertaking to connect in more meaningful ways. Talk a little bit about some of the thoughts you have about access to to performance education, to music, and how powerful that is in communities.
Absolutely. Not only from my standpoint of my own privilege, that I had access from a very early standpoint, even in a family where the intent, and in fact, it was probably disallowed as a thought to think that I'll go into performance as a career. I mean, it had to be a really lengthy process. But I think even not to me, it was transformative. I found my creativity. I found that it was a motivator that then developed all the rest of my skills and my ability to speak analytically, develop myself, and just my affinity for other art forms, literature, and the sciences, etc. So to me, it's just it's a fountain of inspiration that I think every young person needs to be afforded. But also, even taking it outside of my own privilege and seeing what I saw as a young college student at a time that I was an intern for the Sphinx Organization. And Sphinx was just finding its way into the sphere of education and understanding what it would be like to begin to build a pathway for a young person. Watching what happens to a young kid in a Detroit school or a Flint school when the violin is placed in their hands for the first time and they're empowered with the ability to make sound for the first time. I think the myth of somehow talent or ability being differentiated by demographic is an important myth to kill and distill from early on, because we go into elementary schools all around the country with the Sphinx virtuosi, and our musicians adapt and do all sorts of work, engagement work, where they play popular tunes and make kids participate. You can't hear a pin drop when they're talking and performing. So that, I think, the love of and human response to classical music and the brilliance of classical music is universal. It is indistinguishable from one community to another. It's as powerful in a predominantly and almost 100% white Northern Michigan elementary school as it is in the most under-resourced school in Detroit, where we teach music lessons in a chemistry lab because there's not another multi-purpose room. So I think that's a gift. That's the first time to say, it's in some ways, I appreciated my own upbringing in music, in that music and instruments were taught in a way that's very practical, in that it was assumed that we all had the same amount of talent and affinity. And it didn't matter what we looked like. And I want that for the young people. My own children who are grown are, they've been afforded this opportunity, even though I don't think either one of them is going into music, but they've been afforded this opportunity to have music as just one aspect of their development, but it was essential, required, non-negotiable, etc. I want that for every kid, because I see what it does to our ability to be citizens, to be leaders, to lead from every seat, which I think is just so very important. I want everyone, a student, I want a junior administrator, someone who's just starting their pathway and might be on this part of this virtual room. I want them to know they all have power. We each have power.
Right, exactly. And so I'm going to quickly switch gears, and there's a few questions in the chat here. So from Sarah Roth, who's chair of our ballet department, she says, what advice do you have for leadership interested in change, but not desirous of creating a mandate? In other words, not to be prescriptive, I guess. How do we inspire the school-wide reassessing of our approach to curriculum and programming?
It's an excellent question. I think you do this consistently and decisively by bringing in guest talent, by by offering curricula that is not European or white centric, by discovering and individually leading through engagement and recruitment of students, and infusing diversity and excellence consistently and incrementally into your own work as a faculty member. To me, that's not prescriptive. That is, collaborative, suggestive, but also decisive, in that you are, through actions, not through words, because I think those are overrated, through actions illustrating how our curriculum, our school, our department can be better for it if we are diverse, and if we discover, and I don't want to say discover because it's that thing that my students call Columbus effect. We can't discover something that's been there the whole time, right? It's but by introducing and presenting excellence and diversity in action.
You know what, and that connects to something that you were talking about earlier on, which I just absolutely loved. Flipping the interpretation of what diversity and inclusion means, talking about it as opportunity, talking about it as strength gathering, talking about it as being responsive to a world around us, rather than be diminishing of the world that we feel that we want to hold on to. Those are all sentiments that I think are so powerful as a way of framing what might be possible, rather than framing what is taken away. This perception that people have that something's being taken away from them, rather than something that we're opening ourselves to that will strengthen what we do. And I think that proof point, I guess, is the Sphinx organization. You are flourishing as an organization. Society is responding to you. You are receiving funding from extraordinarily powerful sources. I mean, in other words, the orientation that you've positioned yourself with is working. And I think it's a great example of how any cultural organization can reposition itself to be more responsive to society and to grow and strengthen, which I think is just fabulous. Yeah, really great. We have another question here from Jake Woolen, who grew up in Bloomington. He's a fabulous cellist. You probably know who he is, Jake. I don't know if you've met him from Michigan. He studied there. And
yeah, we haven't met, but I know the name.
okay. He's responsible. He was a part of Latitude 49 when it first started as an ensemble.
Mhm.
Anyway, it's great to have you with us, Jake, all the way from Europe. How much is Sphinx engaged globally outside the US, and how might the conditions be different in Europe, for example, as someone currently in Vienna? And what are your feelings about the question of accountability? At what level of the change should we be most focusing our efforts and attention in the pursuit of progress? Where's the accountability?
Oh, it's an excellent set of questions. First, just on a practical level, we do have a program called the Sphinx Global Scholars Program. The intent of that program is to give our artists the opportunity and a chance to teach, learn, and perform. That's the mandate of it. We work with cultural institutions abroad and embassies many times to reach out to and engage with communities that are under-resourced and sometimes at risk of radicalization, and really engage through music and the arts. It's an incredible program. We select our musicians competitively and have done work, exchange work in some cases in South and Central America, in South Africa, and all throughout Europe. A number of our artists have resettled in Europe. I have a couple who are in Vienna. I'd be happy to connect you with if you just reach out to me. And a healthy family that's in Berlin, as well as several artists who have settled or do bicontinental work in the UK. There is a very fantastic organization called the Chineke Foundation that's UK based, but does work all throughout Europe. That's a sister organization to Sphinx, and it's founded by one of our ally artists and former members of the Sphinx Symphony Orchestra, a terrific bassist named Chichi and Wanaku. So Chichi has built something that's very relatable and relative to Sphinx, and is doing that work in Europe, even though some of our communities of color look different. Some of the objectives are really the same. But relative to accountability, I think the only way this works and the only way we push forward to structural and systemic change is that we have to be accountable at every point. Institutions of early learning have to be accountable to themselves, and their accountability is shaped by way of how well we teach our young people and how do we embrace the gift of having the diversity at those levels. And then what are we doing to then set these young people up for the next step? How well are we working and partnering with institutions of higher learning to ensure that they have a way to tap into this incredible talent? And then I think accountability also has to be upheld from the administration and leadership, and at every level, from the recruiters, amongst the recruiters in music schools and conservatories. And that is, how well are we talking to this foundation, to these institutions of early learning, and how well do we know our own audience and our own recruitment pool? And then onward to orchestras and presenting houses and really the rest of the field. I think and honestly, I also hold institutions of philanthropic persuasion accountable, absolutely, because like it or not, I really want change to come for the intrinsic value of it being the right thing to do, but it doesn't work that way, right? Until such time that it will, I do ask and beg and insist upon our foundations and our corporations and our individuals who are giving money to these institutions and in forms of annual giving or bequest or any other giving, hold us accountable. Ensure that when we say we prioritize DEI, we're reaching out to our community, we're building this new program that's going to involve young people in our communities. Hold us accountable. Hold the money until you see some change and help redirect it toward organizations who are championing it, and thereby help us change the landscape, because then the leaders in this field will be rewarded. So it stops everywhere. The buck starts and stops everywhere.
Wow, that's amazing. And I know that we're coming on the hour, but I do have a question for you, especially again, thinking about how this keynote is embedded in conversations that we're having about rural engagement. And one of the things that again that is so impressive about the Sphinx organization and frankly in terms of your own personal life is that there's this seamless connection between what you're doing in the arts and how you seem to be functioning in the business world. There, you're very familiar with and you actually spoke about modeling some of the accountability and systems that we use in the cultural arena along the lines of what some of business has learned to be more accountable, more ethical, more representative. And it reminds me of some of the conversations that's going on here with music, business, and peace. And I know Connie Glenn is on the call here as well. The intersection of these worlds. And I feel very strongly that what you're doing and how you're modeling that sort of seamless connection to the for-profit arena is likewise strengthening what you're able to do in the cultural arena. And so as we look to these communities in South Central Indiana, we want to be able to embark on similar conversations. So my question to you is, how does that work in your DNA? Because it just seems to be so much about who you are.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it comes from viewing this as a privilege. We have the privilege of lessons learned, earned, and disseminated by other fields who've done this better. So why not copy and why not marry up and partner up? We look at the banking industry. We're looking at the tech industry. We look for ways to partner with places like business schools and academic institutions who come in and talk to us and our lead members of the Sphinx Lead program who are looking for executive leadership and are ultimately C-suite bound, and looking at their models. How have they diversified and what have they done to put affinity groups forward to fund positions that insist upon, changing the climate? I mean, for example, one of the lessons I see as is extremely easy to follow is that lots of corporations in general have established a position of either vice president of or director of cultural inclusivity. Sometimes it's called vice president for DEI. We should all do that. I think every music school and conservatory should have one, honestly. And when, honestly, it might even be more clever in institutions that are tenure granting. They should make that be they should add permanency to it by saying that this is a hybrid staff and faculty position where curricula is developed on this, where like the sole work of this position is to transform the climate within an institution. Because I strongly believe that until you fund something, it is no one's job and no one's priority. I can talk all day about, it was a wonderful question from someone about where does the accountability start and end. Well, I can say that it starts and ends everywhere, and I do believe that, but I ultimately think it needs to be someone's job. So we should hire directors and vice presidents and really chairs of inclusion and diversity everywhere possible, and make a commitment for 10 years. Because it's not, if I hire one for 1 year, and then some dean's position is done and the new dean comes in and thinks it really should be something that could be combined with someone else's work, like that's not really related. Right. I know this happens in academia. No, it needs to be someone's job. And to me, that does two things. It puts our money where our mouth and mouthpiece is in some ways, but also it tells our community that we're prioritizing this. And also we can learn because we could do better. Someone can begin developing these modules, prioritize it, look at student climate, faculty climate, staffing, and look at ways in which a institution can transform itself on a wholesome level. So that's
Yeah.
kind of just one idea.
Yeah, that's amazing. It's actually very interesting to hear what you've just had to say because the good news is that the Jacob School of Music has just appointed a DEI director, and there's a committee that's been working over the past few months to really deeply sort of drill into these issues of DEI. So just want to give a shout out to everybody in the Jacob School of Music who feels so passionately about this work. Um, so. Afa, I cannot tell you how amazing it is to have you with us. The conversation could go on for another hour, I know. We look forward to a continued relationship with you and the Sphinx organization. And definitely as we build out our community engagement activities, we will keep in touch with you to seek advice and mentorship. So I just wanted to thank you so much for being with us, for giving us an hour of your time, and just looking forward to staying in touch.
Absolutely. It is my pleasure, and definitely wishing you best of luck on this really important work.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you everybody for being part of our discussion today. We look forward to seeing you again at between 1 and 3 if you want to do the training of ABCD, Asset-Based Community Development Work, which we're very excited about, led by Jane Rogan. And then at 4 o'clock, we have Stanford Thompson joining us from Play on Philly. So it's going to be a day full of really great discussions. Afa, again, thank you so much. Please send our best wishes to Aaron. Another great hero of the musical world, and doing such spectacular work. So thank you so much, and we all look forward to seeing you soon.
Thank you.
Okay, bye bye, everybody.
Take care.